Welcome back to part 3 of our video series on a response to Kieran Skelly's exegesis of Romans 5:12 on his Refuting Calvinism channel. On part 2 of this series, we looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 15 on the subject of the resurrection body, and we were discussing the question about what would be the original state of Adam in the beginning. We found out from our exegesis of 1 Corinthians 15 that his body was both immortal and incorruptible, and also our resurrection body will receive added benefits according to the renewal restoration concept we discussed in part 2, and this chief benefit being that it was a spiritual body. We saw how Paul labored to show the point, getting to a spiritual body, and he worked his way back up inductively to the point of us being made in the image of our new Father, Jesus, being a spiritual man. We'll continue now from that thesis that was developed, and now we will produce more reasons deductively about what the spiritual body looks like. Now, in 1 Corinthians 15, 46-48, there are more details given on that spiritual body, as I said, deductively from the newly asserted thesis that we talked about, where we took a general thesis and now produce supporting details. Beginning in verse 46. But not first is the spiritual one, but the physical one. The first man is made of earth, the second man from heaven. Such as the one made from earth, such also those made from the earth. Also such as the one from heaven, such also those from heaven. Note especially the two humanities being envisioned there, which is important for further discussion of Romans chapter 5 with the term all men. Here the final outcome, there at in other places in Romans 5 we'll be discussing the immediate outcome. Now, the conclusions of 1 Corinthians 15 ends up in verse 49 with a restatement, in other words, or a clarification of the thesis first brought up in verse 45. And even as we bore the image of the one made of the earth, we will bear also the image of the one of heaven. Now this conclusively and decisively states that not only will we receive our original immortality, but it will also later bear the image of the exalted Christ, having spiritual bodies. So, what did the return to our original state mean to Paul, to sum all this up? Death had a physical result, and that's clearly observable to everyone. All men have to physically die directly because of Adam's sin. But our restored state will also be renewed into a spiritual body, after the image of the exalted Christ. Furthermore, other reasons why Mr. Skelly's argument fails is that the Genesis account itself about death does not agree with his assessment at all. Genesis 2:17 states that Adam was commanded not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and if he did, on that very day, he would surely die. Now, Mr. Skelly has claimed that this death only refers to spiritual death, but in the original language of Genesis chapter 2, it is clear. It states quite clearly, "Dying you will die," which indicates a guaranteed surety that they would undergo a long and drawn-out process until they were physically killed from the same day they sinned. Now, that's not to say there was no spiritual death at all in this. It's easily observed that this instantly happened upon their disobedience from their own reactions to each other and God. It may have been that they did not fully understand the full weight of the consequences of their actions. In fact, it was most likely so. Eve was only later informed that the eating of the tree would affect their own spiritual existence. Their eyes opened to know good and evil, being as gods, Genesis 3:3. Now, Satan's extra details turned out to be somewhat true because this did occur, Genesis 3:7, and their behavior was drastically altered. For example, Genesis 3:7, they knew they were naked and attempted to fix the problem. They both hid from God in Genesis 3:8 and see in Romans 3:11 about how this whole notion about would a sinner seek God, where it says quite plainly in Romans 3:11, not there is one diligently seeking after God. There is not one diligently seeking after God. At first, both refused to take responsibility for their actions, blaming one another and of all people, God, Genesis 3:12-13. Now, the whole picture of the account refutes Mr. Skelly's position quite well. The main easily observable feature of their punishment would be a prolonged death. It also had spiritual death included, which they probably did not fully understand till after the fact. Now, what I would like to do in the next few minutes and over the next few parts is to consider some of the possible objections Mr. Skelly or Jesse Morrell or Open Air Preacher and anyone else who denies original sin would bring up about this exegesis of the text. First one, if Adam and Eve were dying physically at the time, why were they expelled so that they might not eat of the tree of life and then live forever? It's a good question. First off, this promised punishment became formal reality before they were removed. Genesis 3:19 makes this point extremely clear. By the sweat of your face you will eat bread, till you return to the ground. For out of it you were taken, for you are of dust, and to dust you will return. Now, did God somehow forget about the possibility of their eating of the tree of life afterwards and had to kick them out because they could circumvent His own death sentence in verse 22 through 23? Surely there is a better biblical response to this issue. First off, how should we do this? Consider previous points that we made in this video series and some new ones. We have already observed that those who die in Christ will be raised incorruptible, immortal, and with spiritual bodies. See 1 Corinthians 15, 42 through 49. Also, those who are alive at the Lord's coming will experience this as well in verse 51. Now let's go back and look at 1 Corinthians 15, 51 through 52 and consider the timing of our change here. Behold, a mystery I speak to you. All of us will not be caused to die, but all of us will be changed in a moment, in a blinking of an eye, in the last trumpet. Now, in a moment comes from the Greek word atomo, or atomos, referring to an indivisible moment in time due to its smallness. See Bauer, Art, and Gingrich, page 120. This will be an almost instantaneous change to this restored new state that we've already discussed. Now, what we're going to do in our next part of this video series is to pick up on this one fact about this instantaneous change into incorruptibility and immortality in a spiritual body and see how well this would fit with Mr. Skelly's own understanding of what the original state of man was and the consequences of eating the tree of knowledge and good and evil and the eating of the tree of life would be. Thanks for watching and stay tuned for the next part of this series.